Hello everyone and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's edition of the show on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. But as always, it should be a good one, starting off with more off-season NFL guides for eliminated playoff teams, switching over to the NFC side of things, talking about the Commanders and the Lions, what they need to do to bolster their rosters to better improve their chances of getting over the hump and potentially competing for a Super Bowl. Then we'll be looking at the MLB free agency cycle. Still a couple of hot stove rumors to go over, specifically with two of the bigger players left in the market, Pete Alonso and Alex Bregman. Then we'll be talking about an interesting topic in college football, the best players who did not declare for the 2025 NFL Draft and are returning, whether as transfers or just remaining with their respective teams for yet another season of college football. And we conclude with a little bit of a premature preview of an exciting Premier League clash coming up in a couple of weeks. But without further ado, before we get into any of this exciting action here on the show, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't done so already and want to keep up to date with all the new content around the network. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat. A little bit of a preview for today's show. The Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, a great way to leave your opinions, feedback, and any input you have for the show on air. And you can also go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, as well. Tips and donations are also appreciated, and it just makes our shows around the network that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to them. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment, talking about the Commanders off-season. Obviously, a team that not a lot of people expected to make the postseason, let alone be one game away from competing for a Super Bowl, with a rookie quarterback, a new head coach, a new GM, and a lot of new faces on this roster. But they did. And they put themselves in a great position to head into this offseason with a clear mindset of how to better improve a roster already looking very much improved from just 2 seasons ago now, or close to 2 seasons ago. But ultimately, I feel like this Washington Commanders team are going to be a very intriguing one to monitor throughout the offseason because they can do a number of things. They have very team-friendly deals in place. Jaden Daniels is still on his rookie deal, and in order to build a team around him, you got to strike while the iron is hot, and that's what I think they can do. But they do have a number of needs that I do believe they need to address, and it might not be able to come in just this one off season. But let's just talk about what they need to do in terms of areas of need to better bolster their chances of continuing to be contenders in both the NFC and the entire NFL. Let's start off with the defensive side of the football, because while there are many positions that need to be addressed in the offseason for Washington, including cornerback, I think that exciting proposition that was just made available as of yesterday for the Washington Commanders is going out and getting Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett requesting a trade to a team that could compete for championships instead of staying with the Cleveland Browns, even though he's kind of forcing his hand in Cleveland a little bit. I think if the Cleveland Browns do make him available, that the Washington Commanders should, like I said, strike while the iron is hot and pick him up. They have a pretty decent interior defensive line, but they don't really have a superstar edge rusher to generate pressure off the edge. And so Myles Garrett can come in and really be the franchise-altering edge rusher they need to not just compete in the NFC, but win Super Bowls as well. And while it's not necessarily the most glaring issue for this Washington defense by any stretch of the imagination, it is one that I would like to see them be proactive about, because Dan Quinn, mind you, is a defensive-minded head coach, and clearly he relies on Cliff Kingsbury to keep this offense humming and clicking as long as Jaden Daniels is their QB. So if he makes steady improvements on the defensive side of the football, the sky's truly the limit for that unit, in the coming seasons. So I do think that a marquee move like that could really alter what this team can become on the defensive side of football. But in terms of the cornerback position, I feel like there were too many times where they were forcing younger players, Mike Sainristil specifically, to play positions they were not necessarily accustomed to. And I feel like an outside corner, maybe someone in the market like a Jack Jones or something, who can play positionless football, very versatile, doesn't necessarily have a defined role in that Las Vegas system, and then move Sainristil inside, that secondary can become a lot more comfortable. I know that they traded for Marshawn Lattimore, but it didn't really end up working out, and I feel like that unit just needs a little bit more depth to it and experience to help a guy like Mike Sainristil in certain situations, even though he performed admirably outside of a comfortable position. But ultimately, I do think that the more pressing, at least for me, issue for the Washington Commanders defense is addressing that defensive line, specifically on the ends. I feel like also, since a lot of the players that you brought in last year to supplement this quote-unquote rebuild for Washington, if you're Dan Quinn and Adam Peters, were players on one-year deals. For example, a guy like Bobby Wagner coming in, only on a one-year deal. But he really was a very vocal leader, especially in that linebacking unit, one of the strong suits for Washington this season. And to lose him will be very interesting. Also on the back end, a guy like Jeremy Chin at the safety position could be very intriguing in terms of trying to re-sign, because he's an option who can also help, not just if Washington also brings an outside corner in for Sainristil, but also really helps define how the secondary can play. Because right now it seems very loose, and while it might take a while to adjust to Dan Quinn's style of defense, this team just needs more coverage options. And having the ability to re-sign a guy like Jeremy Chin should not go unnoticed by Washington. They need to re-sign as many players as they can, retain as many players as they can for continuity purposes, but also add fuel to the fire. You can't just sit back and say, well, we overachieved this season and we can probably head into the same season with the same exact team, run it back. No, you want to continue to add while Jaden Daniels is on a team-friendly rookie deal, because you won't ever get another chance like this if you're the Washington Commanders. I feel like also re-signing a guy like Zach Ertz on the offensive side of the football is very important, because that's another position of need for the Washington Commanders. Are more weapons for Jaden Daniels. And I feel like a guy like Zach Ertz is very much the ethos of what Washington likes to do. They're a very possession-based offensive team. And while Jaden Daniels is certainly capable of stretching the field vertically with a guy like Terry McLaurin, maybe even a guy like De'Ami Brown coming into his own in his second year, I feel like those pieces are nice, but they can be supplemented as well. And I feel like re-signing Zach Ertz as a possession tight end who can move the chains in late down situations could be pivotal to how they address other needs in the receiving core, whether it be through free agency or through the draft. And I think in terms of the draft, there are going to be a lot of guys at the bottom half of that first round at the wide receiver position that a lot of teams are going to covet. And I feel like they might overreach for one of those wide receivers if they're not careful. Teams not just around Washington, but Washington itself. But I feel like out of all those receivers, if there's someone you might want to, say, reach on if you're Washington, it's a guy like Emeka Egbuka. he really complements more of what Ertz does rather than what guys like McLaurin and Brown can open up for this offense as well. So if you're Cliff Kingsbury and you really want to continue to make this offense as diverse as possible, you would love the addition of a guy like Emeka Buka, who is just a very savvy, like I always say about him, route runner, has fantastic hands, really gets the job done in terms of the short to intermediate areas of the field. So if you're Washington and you feel like on the defensive side of the football, there are more players out there in free agency who you could try and get. And then you try and re-sign as many veterans as possible to continue that continuity. And then also in the draft, address the fact that you want more diverse wide receivers in that group. I would say you would pretty much have the perfect offseason for a team like yourself in that you overachieved this season. You're farther along in your rebuild than you could have possibly thought. You were literally one game away from playing in the Super Bowl with a rookie quarterback and an entirely new staff. So I feel like for a team like Washington to have very little to do in the offseason, if you think about it, just three very integral things that I think that can be easily addressed through free agency and the draft, that's pretty remarkable. Because considering where this team was, with all the bad blood from the Dan Schneider regime finally being gone and alleviated with the addition of new people who believed in this team, I feel like anything is possible for Washington. And they made themselves a destination spot by being better than people expected. So who wouldn't right now want to go to Washington while they're a sexy option? Why wouldn't a guy like Myles Garrett not want to come to Washington after the season they had? Why wouldn't you draft a guy like Emeka Buka to really complement perfectly your wide receiver core? Why not resign some of these veterans who you took chances on, the Wagners, the Ertzes of the world, to try and develop that continuity? And most importantly, make the Jaden Daniels era in Washington matter, because that is key. If you're the Washington Commanders, you cannot waste the talent that was discovered in Jaden Daniels. And so that's why I think it's quite remarkable and incredible to behold a team like Washington going into the offseason playing with house money, because nobody would have thought that this team would be in such an exciting position. But let me know what you think about the Washington Commanders and their offseason, how they will address positions of needs. Coming next, we're going to do the same for the Detroit Lions, the team that the Washington Commanders eliminated. Without their two coordinators, what's going to happen this year, going into the season, new horizons. It's Dan Campbell's team now. Let's see what I think about what the Lions offseason will look like right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me